Thanks so much, Cameron. And to get started, we're going to have a little infomercial about the Exchange website. So Cameron, if you can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Are you an adolescent pregnancy prevention or APP grantee receiving funding from the Family and Youth Services Bureau? Do you want to take your teen pregnancy prevention efforts to the next level, but unsure of where to start? The Exchange is the place for you. 3 years ago, we interviewed APP grantees like you about the types of resources and tools they'd like to see on a website to support their programs. A few months later, we launched the Exchange website, which includes resources, an event calendar, blog, comment wall, and a tool that allows you to customize promotional materials. Have a question about human trafficking? Want to find the recording from a webinar you couldn't attend? On our resources page, you can find what you need quickly by using our format and topic filters. Once you select a topic, hover over the image to see the format types like infographics, webinars, podcasts, and online trainings. Want to share a resource with your colleagues and networks? Just select Share to post to your Facebook or Twitter accounts. As APP grantees, you look at teens' health holistically, their relationships, mental health, substance abuse, and physical health. With our event calendar, you will find upcoming adolescent health observances and how to get your program involved. You'll also find the dates and information for in-person trainings, webinars, and conferences offered to APP grantees. Want to create your own infographics, web badges, and tip sheets on teen pregnancy prevention and other adolescent health topics, but don't have time? The Studio tool is your answer. With the Studio, you can add your organization's logo to materials that have already been fact-checked and approved by the Family and Youth Services Bureau. Within minutes, you'll be able to download and share personalized materials to help increase the visibility and impact of your program. To access the Studio tool and other materials developed exclusively for APP grantees, you need to create an account on the Exchange. If you are the primary point of contact for your grant, then you must register before any other project staff can access exclusive content. Each grant can only have one primary contact. Registering takes less than 5 minutes. Just click Register in the top right corner. Select APP Grantee Point of Contact. Then complete the form with your name, grant number, email address, organization, and funding type. Once your account is approved and you set your password, you can add project staff by going to Account and then My Grants. Just enter their names and email addresses, then select Invite, and they'll immediately receive an email granting access to the site's exclusive content. We know you are actively focused on helping youth avoid obstacles to success and prepare them for bright futures. Don't waste time searching the web for resources. Visit the Exchange, your one-stop shop for content and features designed to enhance your APP program.
Awesome. Thank you, Cameron. And we can go to the next slide. To let all of you know, we are recording the webinar today, and we will make the webinar available on the Exchange as well after this. So if there are other colleagues who might benefit from the presentation, you can be sure to share that with them. You can go to the next slide, Cameron. So welcome today. A few logistics. Everyone should be muted. Check your computer audio volume and enable your speaker if you're having trouble hearing. We also have transcription happening during the webinar, so you should be able to read that if you need it. If you're comfortable, we welcome you to share video, particularly if you're asking a question. And then we'd welcome everyone to use the chat box. So if you hover over the screen, for me, it's at the bottom, kind of in the middle. You can enter in a chat. Many folks have introduced themselves. We'd welcome you to introduce yourself. Tell us where you're zooming in from today. And that's another place where you can put your questions. We'll try to answer questions for clarity as we go, and then we'll have time for question and answer more fully at the end. And throughout the presentation. You can go to the next slide, Cameron. Our presenters today, I'm really excited. We have a great panel of presenters. We have Karen Coyle and Lisa Unti, both from ETR, who are going to share their wealth of expertise with us on packaging and dissemination. And we also have folks joining us from the field, Sharon Rodine, who works in Oklahoma and was a round 1 PREIS grantee, and Leslie Clark from LA, who was a round 1 and round 2 PREIS grantee, are going to share some of their expertise with us. You can go to the next slide. We hope by the end of this webinar, you'll be able to describe the broad steps for disseminating an innovative program and the pros and cons of different scaling models, that you'll be able to explain FYSB guidance related to finalizing, packaging, and disseminating the findings and the programs themselves, identify other resources that support dissemination, reflect on key considerations for packaging and disseminating your programs, and then identifying aspects of a packaging and dissemination plan and the tools you might need to achieve that plan. And I did want to just let you all know that we are planning to have a cluster call for PREIS grantees on this topic on January 7th as a follow-up to this webinar. We'll be sharing a tool at the end of the webinar that we hope you'll have a chance to take a look at and consider how it might apply to the point that you are in terms of your packaging and dissemination process. And then we can use the call in January to talk a little bit more about where you are, what challenges and successes you had, and how we can support each other to meet those guidelines and the sort of the requirements for packaging and disseminating, and also your goals for how you are going to spread the word about your program. You can go to the next slide, Cameron. In terms of an agenda, we're going to have some introduction to broad frameworks around dissemination. We'll hear from Jessica Johnson at FYSB on their guidance for packaging and dissemination, other considerations, and this has been informed also by work in the field, approaches you might take to scaling your programs more broadly, hearing from both Sharon and Leslie about their lessons learned. We'll have an opportunity for a little bit of self-reflection, questions and answers, and then we'll also be providing you with more resources where you can find more resources and technical assistance. And as we get started, just to warm us up, if you go to the next slide, Cameron, we have a question for you for the chat. We'd love to hear, if you could use the chat box, what is one hope you have for disseminating your program? One hope for disseminating your program. Go ahead and chat it in, and you can tell us the grantee that you're with as well. And if you're an evaluator, you can tell us one hope you have for what dissemination might look like from your perspective. Go ahead and type that into the chat. We have a number of these throughout, so. Program successes, great. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else? My hope is that others will come to see academic success as an adaptive behavior that lowers the risk of pregnancy for lower income African American students. Awesome, thank you. To effectively reach the most vulnerable youth with limited access to Wi-Fi. Thank you. Well, as you're going through the webinar today, I hope you give some thought to what your hope is for dissemination. These are some great hopes that we have, and I think, following some of the tools and resources we can get there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Unti, who's going to kick us off with some frameworks.
Or actually,
Karen,
I'm going to take this one.
Karen.
Hi, all. I'm just going to start, and Cameron, you can advance to the next slide, to just give us some context for today by looking at this a research framework. And this is an animated slide, so we'll move along as I talk. You don't have to go all the way through yet, Cameron. So we looked at and created a framework to think about how programs move from the research phase or the innovation, development, and testing phase, which is what we're all in, all the way to scale. And this one was adapted from the literature. We looked at many different frameworks, and this is informed by Kruder and colleagues. And we have that citation on the bottom and others. And it just describes a common pathway for these programs to give context for today. So we test a lot of interventions. And then once they're tested, and Cameron, next click, please. Not all of them will come out of that testing with evidence of effectiveness or evidence that meets existing evidence thresholds if those are in play. And from there, next click, we also lose programs from if among those that are effective, there may not be demand for all of those that are effective for a variety of reasons. It may be the demand is limited due to feasibility or resources, fit, adaptability or acceptability in a community. And so those factors affect demand. Certainly in our field, available funding streams like PrEP and OPA often dictate program demand. So then if there's demand, next click, please. Programs often also then will fall out of the pipeline because there's not enough resources for packaging and dissemination. And this is where the brilliance of FYSB's investment in this area for all of us as PREIS grantees is really important, because it's going to help us reduce losing programs out of this pipeline, because we have the opportunity to create this packaging and dissemination. So next click. Once you have your program packaged and with your end users in mind, then there is an opportunity to think about, where do you want to take it? Where do you want to scale? Do you want to scale deeply in a community? Do you want to scale out to grow and touch more users? And so we'll cover, we'll focus on the tail end of this, the packaging and the scaling today. But this again is just to give context for the day and talk about the dissemination process. So a couple more clicks, Cameron. This process is really, there's a couple of feedback loops that come into play as well. When we disseminate programs, monitoring certainly informs both our programs, and it informs our packaging and marketing and dissemination efforts. And then also data on demand certainly informs more research. So next slide. This framework really comes with 3 assumptions that are important to call out quickly. Not all programs make it out of the research setting. There may not be evidence of impact, and we may need to retest, or it's not the impact that we wanted it to be at the level we wanted it to be. Next slide, please. Those that do come out, not all programs are widely used or used effectively. And one more click there. And then the third assumption, which is really important for us to reflect on for today, is that there's this general lack of infrastructure to carry out marketing and dissemination. And not all organizations will have the infrastructure or the desire. Some may, but you may end up needing to look for partners in order to take on the dissemination part of scaling. And so we'll be talking about that today. ETR is a unique organization in that we work across this framework. We do research, we develop programs. We do have a products unit that packages and disseminates and scales. And so we'll be sharing insights from that work. We work with developers to just help them disseminate their program, and we'll be sharing some of the insights throughout the webinar from those developers as well. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Johnson to talk about FYSB's guidance, so we're all level set on what we're required to do.
Thank you, Karen. So FYSB's guidance related to packaging and dissemination is outlined in two places. One is your funding opportunity announcement, and the second place is your PREIS Grant Administration guidance document. Just as a reminder, we did send an updated version of that guidance document in November. So if you haven't received that already, please reach out to your project officer. Next slide. So a PREIS grant requirement is to package your intervention so that it's implementation ready and available for replication. On the next slide, I'll go through what we mean by implementation ready. And after you package your curriculum and your intervention, we also would like for you to disseminate it through presentations. PREIS grantees are also required to submit at least one manuscript to a peer-reviewed journal article, and that manuscript has to be reviewed by your project officer before submission. I do want to clarify that the grant requirement isn't to get acceptance, it is just to submit. We don't have enough in our timeline to wait for the acceptance, but we definitely think it is useful and valuable for PREIS grantees to add to the research. Next slide. Okay, so when we say implementation ready, we are talking about a couple of things. One of the things is sharing information about the design and implementation. So what are the core components of your intervention? What is the logic model and the theory that backs your intervention? And how was the program implemented? All PREIS grantees are now working on a PREIS lessons learned, and you've documented the implementation throughout. This can definitely be a part of your packaging and dissemination. And the second piece are the materials to implement the intervention. This is your facilitator guide, your curriculum, and your training materials. And also what do others in the field need to implement this? What fidelity monitoring tools do they need? How much can they adapt the curricula? And last but not least, your evidence of effectiveness, which you would know from the analysis of your findings. I would also like to share that just this week, your project officer should have sent out a draft of the impact evaluation report template. That template is just as an FYI, we're still working on OMB clearance, but we wanted to share it with you so that you would know what to expect. But the expectation now is not to complete it, but just to review it. We will contact you and let you know when you are allowed to complete it and turn it in. Okay, I will now pass it on to Lisa Unti.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So in this slide, just a brief kind of review, going back to the framework that Karen described earlier. As part of the PREIS efforts, grantees will be disseminating their research findings and develop an implementation ready product, as Jessica just went over some of those important reminders. In addition to that, and other considerations and guidance is that FYSB strongly recommends that the grantees think about and start planning and preparing for a dissemination plan that addresses the later steps in the scaling process, which we're going to go into in a few slides coming up. But so really quickly, well, let's use our virtual hands. If you can find the raise your hand feature on Zoom. By show of hands, how many of you are planning to disseminate your program yourselves? And if you can't find that feature, you can chat that, type that in the chat as well. I am not seeing, are we seeing the hand raising?
I don't see anybody using it, but you can,
Yeah.
if you pop out the participants, that's where you can find it.
Yeah. There we go. let's see.
Oh, Donna had a question of who else might disseminate it. Great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. We're going to be tackling some of those considerations in a little bit. So can we hold that question, Donna, and we'll come back to that. So now also using the chat, what are some elements on the implementation ready list that you might already have completed? Just a quick review of that if you have, if you can type into the chat. And if you're not all the way through that list, or you're just starting it, that's okay too. Just anywhere on that list that Jessica just reviewed, if you could share where you might be at. Let's see. Give people another minute to maybe type some thoughts in there. If not, we'll come back to that as well, maybe as we continue on. So why don't we go to the next slide in the interest of time, Cameron, that'd be great. And you can go to the next slide. So I'm going to take a few minutes to just talk about some considerations for packaging and dissemination, just some high level areas to get us started. So let's go through each of these briefly. So thinking about nature and strength of the evidence, at your current stage, as we just talked about, you may not have results from your evaluations. Many program developers consider the nature and strength of evidence and thinking about next steps for dissemination. For example, you may spend more time refining the package and retesting if the program did not produce the desired impacts. Another key factor for reflection at this stage is what gaps does your program address? For example, focusing on populations that are underserved, or addressing gaps and ensuring we get those programs out there for others to use is an important consideration in your programming or planning. So thinking about where you are to answer that question. Another important consideration is intellectual property and ownership rights. For many developers, the intellectual property and copyright is an important issue to address early in the scaling process. And some questions to get you thinking about that might be, what, if any, releases do you need to secure as part of that process? If you modified an existing program, what are the rights attached to that ownership and dissemination of that product? And Sharon will be touching on this a little bit more during her presentation. Other considerations around packaging, there's certainly multiple options for your packaging approaches to consider. Some of these are whether or not to do only print or hard copies, or to go all digital, or maybe a hybrid. Certainly, given the increasing push to go digital, digital is certainly an important option to be thinking about, and there's many variations in how that might occur and how the users may experience that. For example, delivering through a learning management system. Some programs might also simply make PDFs that are downloadable. Although many educators in the field still prefer having a hard copy and like digital supports. So another option or consideration might be a blended approach, or creating digital supports like PowerPoints or fillable forms for participants. Certainly there's a lot of options, and I think we're learning a lot during COVID about many of those options right now. So all these options require ongoing support and updating. So it's important consideration as well about the timing and just planning for those updating practices and the cycles and the resources necessary to make those updates. For example, factual updates on a regular basis, or medical accuracy review and updates.
Lisa, before you move on, I want to add a couple things on the packaging part. COVID certainly has elevated us reflecting on what additional supplemental materials that users might benefit from, and that's something that you can reflect on as you're working on your materials. like having core PowerPoints to use with their instruction, which some of the group-based programs may or may not have those. So that's something to keep in mind as you're working on your materials, or alternative video sources that might be free. If you do feature videos that might get dated, then you're going to need to focus on video and video management. That's been a source of challenge for developers as videos age, and something that just comes up a lot in terms of these packaged interventions and supporting users. Other things that we ended up developing because of COVID is virtual guidance. So how do you deliver, or what changes can we do in a virtual world? So those are some of the supplemental materials that are becoming either obvious that we need to be providing more support for potential users, but also it's really important to engage your end users, determine who that is and engage them in what will help them with a successful implementation. You also can reflect on, as Jessica noted, your lessons learned in implementation in thinking about some of those supplemental materials. That will inform some of your thinking there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. All great points and lessons learned, certainly from the last 9 months or so. Okay, next slide then. So continuing on with some other considerations to be thinking about, certainly specifying core components is critical for dissemination. So here's a few things to consider. Focusing on the unique features and essential elements, which may be dictated by theory or learning, implementation science, and include implementation content and pedagogical aspects of the program. They may also be components you're testing in your evaluation, but think about what cannot be changed without compromising the integrity of your program. For example, we talked about the implementation components. So some programs have the core implementation components deemed critical to their success, such as group size, number and characteristics of facilitators, things like that. So start thinking about those things, which are core, which might be flexible or adaptable. And then the content and pedagogical components. And again, the theory may dictate that certain content must be included and how it must be taught. For example, condom use demonstration with individual practice, for example. But as Karen mentioned, with COVID and having to adapt and do things virtually, start thinking about what that adaptation might look like. Certainly use the research to provide data about which components are key. For example, some sites might have randomly assigned participants to a single or combination elements. The results of those studies may guide decisions on your core components. So, or research from others may help inform what gets labeled as core. As an example of that, texting research may support designating a texting component of a multi-component program as core. But it's important to just be thinking about those pieces now. So I think the bottom line or the takeaway message for everyone on this call really is, as the developers, you need to start thinking about these determinations as you prepare your list of core components for dissemination. This also helps frame other critical dissemination tools, such as your allowable adaptations. What are the unique features of your program? What is essential to your program's success? What data do you have that might inform your core components? All of those things will help inform those decisions that you'll be providing and the guidance. And then speaking of guidance, and Karen talked a little bit about the virtual guidance, but around that, additional considerations for adaptation and implementation guidance is thinking about the users and what kind of support from the preparation stage, that is this a fit for our site? Can we use this in this context? Through implementation, what and how much can I adapt or improve the fit? So really, it's starting to think about that now, because you will get those questions. Karen can share more examples from the questions that we get as developers about, will this program work for this population and under what circumstances? So starting to think about and developing guidance around that.
I'd like to add a little bit, because that's a really important area to center on and think about. And there is a little tension that sometimes comes up in a desire to explode and like increase impact and get your program out there. And yet really reflect on its best use and the lane it was developed for and tested in. So that's an important aspect. And you will, if you are scaling out, or even if you're scaling deeply in your community and starting to introduce it into other places just in your community, you will get lots and lots of questions about, can I use it with this age group in this setting? Can I morph it this way? Can I morph it that way? Will it work in this context? And so all of that, this FYSB is providing us with the opportunity to really reflect on that and write that down now. Again, some of that could come from your experiences in the trials that you're conducting now. You've seen some of the adaptations that either had to be made, or you're in the fly in an applied study, you're making adaptations. You may or may not want to support or recommend those things. So those are really the use and non-use, and being very critical there and intentional. And just very transparent with users will increase the opportunity for fit. And in the implementation science literature right now, this contextual fit is a really important factor for us to be thinking about. These don't all fit in every community. And it's important for us to acknowledge that they were developed with a particular audience in mind. And one example that comes up is reducing the risk. Reducing the risk is a school-based curriculum for high school students. And in another study, a group decided to use reducing the risk with pregnant and parenting teens and drop it into that context. It wasn't designed for that population. No big surprise. It wasn't super acceptable to that population either. They were like, this doesn't represent my life, my context. And so that was, an indication of a non-use. We are now more explicit, like it's not great. It's not appropriate for that population. There are other programs that would be a better fit. So that's part of what you get to do right now when you're working on these materials, is really think through that. Thanks, Lisa.
Great, thanks, Karen, for that addition. So let's just do a quick little check-in with everybody. And in the chat box, you can share some thoughts about how have you identified the core components of your program? Give everybody a moment to think about that, and then see if anybody's sharing anything. There's always that little bit of delay. It's okay, hopefully. Let's see, thank you for sharing. We've got through study of the curriculum, modules, and implementation activities. Great. Give it outlined in our logic model. Great, thanks, Donna. Through the use of questions like Karen has chatted in, and mentorship by others who have done it before. Great. Great. So let's continue on, and we'll circle back to sharing out some of these ideas as we finish out. So just finally, another consideration or list of considerations as you think about the packaging and dissemination is really around the capacity to disseminate and support users. And so it's critical to reflect on your organization's capacity to distribute the program, if that's what your decision is. and to support those who will be using it. So let's just run through some key areas for consideration. So certainly developers take various stances on training and technical assistance. Some want to be very involved, whereas others might recognize that they don't have the capacity or the skilled trainers or time for that level of support. So some developers have different philosophies about the training requirements as well. Some think it's critical for new implementers to be trained at a certain level of detail, that the program would be replicated with fidelity rather than being adapted. Others feel that it's critical for new implementers to understand the core components or the essence of the program, and then might be less worried about adaptations. Either way, it's more about who's going to be doing the training on what level of, I guess, maybe control or involvement the developer wants in the training, and which we could dedicate an entire webinar on that, but we don't have time to go down that road right now. But the point is it's important to reflect on this and think about what your desire is and what your stance is now as a developer, so that you can think about that as part of the dissemination process. Most developers recognize that widespread fidelity monitoring for new users is also an important gap in the scaling process. So organizational capacity to take on all of these activities, as well as the issues such as quality concerns, issues and ramifications of poor implementation, intervention complexity, are common themes developers need to balance in deciding whether to create the structures to disseminate themselves, which we'll hear later from Leslie later today on the AIM for Teen Moms, or partner with another organization that does the work with you or as a partner with you. So there's also blended examples and approaches. I think Karen, you've alluded to some of these, but ETR, we develop programs, we disseminate some of our programs, but we also support packaging and marketing for other programs. And in some cases we disseminate, and the developer maintains the training piece and capacity around that. So there's a lot of different models around that. And Get Real is an example of one of those models where we disseminate the program, but we do not train on the program. And Karen, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that, but those are just some examples and considerations, a lot to think about. So I'm going to pass this on to Karen now to talk about approaches to scaling.
Okay, so we're going to talk about scaling. And before we talk about the scaling out, there's really different types of scaling, and we're drawing on some of the work from Dees and Anderson that are at Duke University, the Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship, have done a lot of work at looking at scaling or disseminating social innovations. So they talk a lot about the need to reflect on the readiness and need to scale, and reflect on where the need is greatest. You may want to scale deeper. So they reference as scaling deep, and that may be that your focus is really increasing your impact at home, in your home community. You also may want to scale out by increasing impact by spreading to new communities. So there's both this deep approach or out. These types, this continuum of types of scaling approaches is really, I'm going to reflect more on the scaling out. Before you get to this, you'll be thinking about, am I ready to even scale? And some of that ties back to the FYSB guidance. First of all, do we have impact? If we don't, then let's rethink what we need to do next. Do we need to refine, retest, better understand the program and how we design user needs or client needs, and retool it a little bit, test it more. If we are, and we do have impact, and there's a need for it, then do we have the organizational support to do the scaling, or do we need to find a partner to work with in that process? And then the other dimension to reflect on is timing. Is it the right time? And COVID clearly raises the issue of timing and thinking about, is this the best time for us to be launching? Can my intervention be easily adapted in a virtual world and delivered that way? If not, maybe this part of the dissemination process, the scaling, you hold on, you get the package ready, you talk to and define your end users, talk to them, understand their needs, and then go more slowly with scaling it up. So the different approaches here, branching, affiliation, and dissemination that Dees and Anderson talk about, we have the reference to this paper, and it's very accessible paper if you're interested in any of these models. We're going to just talk about this continuum. In a branching world, you might have a main organization who then scales their program through other local sites. And it's just kind of like a company with branch stores. There's another, and there's a lot of control there. The main organization controls the content, the messaging, the brand, et cetera. And so that's important concept in this continuum here, is level of control and support. There's another approach, which is an affiliation approach. And that's a slightly more flexible approach. It's a formal agreement between two or more communities or two or more parties to be part of a network. And if you're familiar with some of the existing programs, there's a couple that use this approach. The Carrera model is an example where there's they disseminate their program through an affiliation model. New users are vetted and supported through a formal process, and then they become part of this dissemination network. And then on the far right side of this scale is the dissemination approach. And this is really providing information, instructions, and a model for communities to replicate. And this is where ETR sits. This is, we work with developers, we support the packaging, and then it's disseminated, and we are not really controlling users. We're supporting them, but they're not formally connected to us in that way. So this is a range of, or these are some options that are being used to scale out pregnancy prevention programs and other social innovations. Next slide. And of course, like everything, there's multiple variations within each option in terms of how you might branch or affiliate or disseminate. So in branching, for example, perhaps you have an organization that has multiple locations, and currently you have your program only in one branch. You might want to scale to other branches that already exist, or you may want to grow in new locations. In the affiliation arena, there's like from tight to looser controls or affiliation practices that could occur in that sphere or that type of scaling out. And that might be joint ventures. It might be as simple as providing certification and TA and quality checks. So there's a lot of wiggle room in there and how tight you want that affiliation model to be operating. And same in the dissemination model. You might set up a program and then hand it off to partners, and they're off and running. You might provide training and or technical assistance, or in some cases, you might want to just have it open source on the web. And those are all different models. You'll see, for example, CDC's effective intervention website. You can get access to programs, download them, and all the supports that PREIS is setting us up to, and FYSB is supporting us to develop, but they're open source, and users are able to access them and then run with the implementation. Next slide. So I think the bottom line here is just really thinking about what's important. The branching and affiliation increase your control as a developer or an organization that might be disseminating. It may increase in fidelity. It depends on how engaged you are. It definitely will help with capacity if that's part of the resource package that you put together. Whereas if you go towards a dissemination route, you're increasing expansion and promoting transferability. You're supporting users, but with less control. So those are some of the trade-offs that you can be considering as you're thinking about how you might want to scale out. So next slide. There's really no right or wrong approach to scaling, but you need to think critically about your program and your scaling philosophy. That's super important. And Dees and Anderson provide a guiding framework, the 5 R's, to help individuals reflect on some of these areas that are really important in terms of scaling approach. So readiness, receptivity, resources, risk, and returns. We'll go through them briefly, and then you'll have an opportunity to hear from both Leslie and Sharon in terms of some of the choices they made. So readiness, next slide, please. Is your program ready to be spread? Again, we're going back to one of the key criteria that FYSB laid out is you have evidence of impact. If it's not ready, maybe you need to retool it. We've said that. Maybe you need to re-explore. Maybe you need to go deeper instead of out. Are your core components transferable? Will other agencies or users be able to pick up this program and implement it? And I'll give you an example of a program that we developed early on, Safer Choices. We had well-defined core components. The program is not the most transferable though, super complicated to implement. And what happened is then that impacted people's ability to use it. They would then use one piece of it, but not all of it. So those are some things to think about in terms of your core components, how you're defining them, how you're packaging them, and providing users with enough guidance to pick it up and use it in a new community. And then another readiness question to ask yourself is, does your organization make the investment of time, energy, and resources for scaling, or do you need to look at partnerships to do that? And again, PREIS can't acknowledge enough how important this process of packaging is, that FYSB is investing with us. It's a huge barrier that we now have the support to navigate. So receptivity, next slide, please, is another important question for you to reflect on. Will the program be well received in the communities that or in other communities? Is it easily understood? There's the Safer Choices example. Does it align with local values? It may or may not. And that's where you need, as developers, really need to reflect on who's this program for and be very transparent about that. Is the program adaptable for local control? Are users willing to invest the time, energy, and resources? Does it press against existing practices that will make its uptake less likely? How do you rectify that or support that in the materials that you're developing? This again is an area in the implementation science research, the fit and pushing against either what's already in place or facilitators' attitudes about what's best for their clients or their participants or their students. How does your program fit there? And I think in thinking about some of the supporting documents you're creating is keep receptivity in mind so that you can have help users assess the fit with their communities. Okay, next slide. Resources are always an issue in everything we do. So you need to have a resource plan in mind. You can think about both the resources that you need to scale out, as well as resources that might be generated to help the scaling through things like product sales or network membership, licensing, training. Generally, those sorts of resources are used to help with the scaling out process. Next slide. So risks, another R, is really thinking about your scaling approach with the risks of incorrect implementation. And the risks really will inform your model. The Carrera program is a good example. That's a very complex intervention. There's a strong brand there, and there's risk if it's implemented poorly, both to the success of the outcomes in terms of the brand itself. And so that likely contributed to a choice of an affiliate model as opposed to just a dissemination model. So thinking about risks when you're thinking about how you might scale, whether it's even in your community or beyond your community, is an important consideration. And then lastly, returns. So the next slide, please. So you can think about what's the bottom line, and we should be really anchoring beyond just more people being served, and really anchor on how well can they be served, and cost effectiveness in our resource intense environments where we don't have endless resources to support programming. So once you reflect on whether you're going to scale deep in your community, whether you're going to scale out to new communities and how you might do that, then you're going to need to loop back to your readiness R and reflect on what, if any, resources or partnerships you may need in order to accomplish your goals. Next slide, please. So again, actually, it's just a reminder with these scaling out with these three approaches here, that you're balancing control versus expansion in making decisions on how you might scale. Next slide. So we're going to have you do a quick chat, and then we're going to turn it over to Sharon and Leslie to give you a deep dive into some of these considerations that have been popping up for them. So just thinking right now, what model of scaling might be most appropriate for your program? Scaling deep, scaling out? If scaling out, is it branching, affiliation, dissemination? What are your thoughts at the moment? And I don't know, or not sure yet, is also a fine response at this stage of the game.
We did get a question while you were talking about, could you potentially have a combination of branching and dissemination, for instance? Like, could you think about pulling these models together maybe?
I think what we can, let's talk about that. I want to put a pin in it because I want to definitely make sure that Sharon and Leslie have time. But yes, there are potential combos and blends that we can talk about in the Q&A. So can we do that, Katie? Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. And I don't know, Angelique, if that's what you all are leaning towards now. So I just wanted to bring it up. And we did get one response to so far, dissemination.
Yeah, okay. Okay. All fair. I mean, it's just, yeah. And before I pass it on to Sharon, this is living, breathing process, and clearly one that is like worthy of CQI. You're always going to be thinking about, is this working? Am I worried about what I'm seeing or experiencing? And do I need to make changes in how I'm scaling? Or are we ready? If you've elected to scale deep, we're going to go deep in this community. At some point in the future, you may be reflecting, okay, now we're ready to add another community and go deep in that community, but a very stepwise process. So lots of considerations and options. So we will address and talk about combos when we get to the Q&A. Next slide, please. I'd like to pass it off, and this will be a great opportunity for you to hear some deep dives. Sharon and Leslie are both going to share some of the considerations that they went through and their choices for disseminating 2 programs. So Sharon?
Thank you. And Karen, that was a great segue, because it is a journey. And you start out lots of things you can control, lots of questions you ask yourself, lots of partners and resources and options and opportunities you keep considering as you go through. And then some other things change that are outside of your control, and you have to pivot and take a different path. So I'm excited to be here today to share some of our lessons learned on both ends of receiving a curriculum, taking it, reshaping it, and then moving it on to have a life after our rigorous research. I'm going to go through some questions and issues we considered in our transition with the Power Through Choices. And next slide, please. The Power Through Choices was the last federally funded project I worked with at the Oklahoma Institute for Child Advocacy, and it was developed in the mid-90s by Richard Barth and Marla Becker. They were at the School of Social Work at the University of UC Berkeley at the time, and they had a grant to work on a curriculum for youth in foster care. And when they got done with that particular project, they handed it off, Dr. Barth handed it off to the National Resource Center for Youth Services, which was based in Oklahoma, in Tulsa. And it was federally funded, now affiliated affiliated with the University of Oklahoma. We had we at the Institute had a CDC project. We were part of the Promoting Science-Based Approaches initiative. And during that time, I was on a conference call with a whole lot of people talking about teen pregnancy prevention and youth in foster care that was hosted by the national campaign, now Power to Decide. And I'm on the call, multitasking and working on my computer, and all of a sudden I hear Kristen Terzakian say, and the only curriculum we found that was developed with and for youth in foster care is at the National Resource Center for Youth Services in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay, I'm sitting in Oklahoma City. The director of that organization is on our board, and I'm emailing him right away to say, what is this? We pulled it out. It had been given to them. They thought it was a natural fit for them to take it and really promote it, and it did not happen. So we revised it. We took the project, the curriculum, we revised it. The PREIS funding was available. We conducted a rigorous evaluation with the University of Oklahoma Health Science Center, and we were also part of the Mathematicas cross-site big evaluation. So we came out of it. It was a wonderful experience with the PREIS grant. We worked with sites in California, in Oklahoma, and Maryland. We had a great curriculum that we revised throughout. We had great, solid research findings. We had worked on rebranding. We had a website. We had testimonials. We had worked on a lot of promotional products. We had networks that we were working with the foster care folks at the federal level and with the different states. But we got to where we needed to figure out what was the next step. And internally, our organization had changed directors a couple times, changed the board a couple times, and we did not feel we had the capacity to be the entity that marketed it, developed and distributed it, provided the training, and gave it life after after the research project. So we passed it on to the Healthy Teen Network. That was an organization I've had a long association with and I had a lot of trust in, and it seemed like a good match. So that's kind of our quick journey. Next slide. Questions we ask ourselves, and we ask a lot of questions because it's hard to give up something you put your whole life into and that you see as a wonderful thing, and you're just sure nobody can take it and love it and care about it and provide the training and everything that you feel you could. But being realistic, we looked at the role of our organization. Could we continue the marketing? Did it fit the organization's mission and capacity? Had we successfully marketed anything in the past? And I'm looking around going, we can't even make money on selling t-shirts. How are we going to do this? I mean, we're a statewide nonprofit advocacy organization. So marketing a curriculum and program wasn't really in our lane. We looked at the costs and really tried to take a serious look at staffing, materials, storage, shipping, how many people, how much of the scope of work for an organization is involved in doing all of those pieces, and not even the training part. We had developed training materials. We'd piloted the trainings in different states with different groups. We had it all together. We just, in looking seriously at the role of our organization, the commitment, the capacity, and the costs involved, and potential sources of income, because we think, oh, well, this group could buy it, schools will want it, the Office of Juvenile Affairs will want it, this will want it. And really, maybe when you have the beginning of a federal grant and you're on a list or whatever chosen by some groups, there will be those who want to use your materials, but you need an ongoing revenue stream to keep everything going and to be able to market and provide the training. You need renewable funding resources. We did not have them. And my cautionary point here that is not news to anybody, the budgets for so many of our potential audiences are going to change dramatically coming out of this pandemic, whether they're school budgets, whether they're state agencies or nonprofits and others. So when you're taking a realistic look at the costs here, really amplify your look at where your audience is going to come from, and do they have the budgets now? The spirit may be willing, but they may not have the capacity, whether it's a university or whatever. We were looking at whether our organization had the option for finding other funds. And again, there's a lot of competition out there for other funds at this point in time. So looking seriously, we said we had all the pieces on the program side, but we did not have the organizational infrastructure to make it happen and capacity to make it happen. So next slide. Again, marketing readiness, we'd put it all together. We had gone through a whole branding. I could give you a whole story behind how we came up with that big, strong bird. That is our logo there. And all of you know there's so much that goes into thinking through all of the aspects of your promotional materials. You're preparing materials for different target audiences. You're looking at types of marketing, and you're looking at what needs to be done in terms of adaptations for the continued virtual implementation, which we did not have to consider then, but that adds, as Karen has so well described, a whole nother layer of things that you need to think about. Next slide. And we thought about, as we move through this and all the time thinking, can we do this? Do we need to partner? Where's a partner? How could we make this work? We were working early on with copyright, with trademark. We engaged an attorney who specialized in intellectual property law. Our attorney, give yourself plenty of time on this, is what I will say, because the attorney we started working with got ill, and then we had to start with a whole new attorney. We found there was another group out there that had the same name copyrighted, Power Through Choices, but it was an expired copyright, and it was something that was no longer in operation, but it still took time to get all of that worked out. So give yourself plenty of time in looking at those issues, find a friendly attorney who really loves what you're doing too, so they'll make it a priority, and consider the budget costs that need to go into all of that. The other piece on this I'd add is, as you look at all of these pieces, we had funding from another, in addition to the PREIS grant, we had some funding that supported part of this project from a private foundation. And so we had to keep the other funders who had invested in what we were doing involved, and communicating with them about our path and where we were going on all of this. Next slide. Some final thoughts here in transitioning. We obtained the curriculum from an organization that appeared at the time that it would have had all of the capacity needed to take it and run with it. When Dr. Barth handed it off to the National Resource Center, they had access to all of the foster care networks, state and local. They provided training. This was what they did in working with this system-involved youth, but they didn't have the commitment for this particular program. They didn't have a history of working with sexual health education with young people. They didn't have the staff that were trained in all of that. So sexual health education was not part of their core work. And so the curriculum was on a shelf back in the storage room, and that's where it sat. So when we were offered the opportunity to take it, work with it, evaluate it, and then we had all the pieces ready to hand it off. And so we talked to the Healthy Teen Network. We had partnered with them. I was an ED for that organization long ago when it was called the National Organization on Adolescent Pregnancy, Parenting, and Prevention. So I had a long affiliation and a lot of trust. And so that made it easier to find a way to transition it and to feel confident we were giving it off to the right folks. It fit their mission, it fit their scope of work, it fit their expertise. They had a track record of providing quality trainings and programs. And the one last thing I wanted to add here is that throughout our journey on this, and as we have transitioned it on to the Healthy Teen Network, we acknowledge the key people who were part of the journey at the beginning, Dr. Barth and Marla Decker and others. We gave credit to everyone as we went along. It served us well when it came to working out ownership issues, because there was not a clear paper trail when Dr. Barth gave it to the National Resource Center. So we had to work through ownership issues, and he signed off and Marla signed off, and we got it all worked out. But acknowledging people's work and giving them credit early on all the way through helps if you have to work on the ownership issues. And we've appreciated the credit that Healthy Teen Network has given us as the ones that passed it on to them. So we feel like we're all raising, growing this wonderful thing that in the end achieves the goal that we were after in helping improve the health and the lives of system-involved youth across the country. So I will pass it off to Leslie.
Sorry. Thank you, Sharon. And I want to say ditto to everything that Sharon said. Even though we ended up in different destinations, I think almost every single thing that you've said are definitely experiences that I've had firsthand. Maybe our copyright issues were slightly different, but it's also a lot, right? So it's like you ran through so much information, which is exactly what I think impinge on the decision making that people with their programs and their versions of programs need to take into account. So you can go to the next slide. I think I have been thinking before we started our webinar, sharing these slides with you, I got a chance to see everybody's slides, but also as we're going through it today, it still impacts how I think of what I want to tell you in a short amount of time. So I do want to say that, you know, I think I ended up at a slightly different place, in part because of what happened to me, how I found my way into intervention, development, and testing, and then some of those experiences that happened to me along the way. But I really do believe that that a part of why I decided to do more of our dissemination in-house was really in part of because of the nature of the intervention itself. So both at the time when I first developed the intervention and tested it, which was in the 90s, even still to some extent to today's time, that many of the programs that we have available that are evidence-based, not all of them, but many of them share commonalities across their logic models because of the shared theories that they have and so on. And Project DAME, the original one of my interventions that is being disseminated for middle school kids, really was predicated on, it was built on a different theory, but also a different reasoning, if you will. Right. So at the time that I developed it, there really was a need in this country for something. There were kind of struggles between harm reduction models and contexts that were really saying, that we're not going to allow those models in our school settings for middle school and so on. So there was very much kind of more of an abstinence-based approach in a particular style. Abstinence-based has become more broad now, but back in those days, there was sort of a very certain template or form of abstinence-based models, and then there were harm reduction models. And so Project AIM was really developed to be neither one of those two, but to be able to be something that wasn't based on, that was going to be able to deal with the obstacles of potentially a different pathway for kids to change their risk behaviors than them, being taught specifically about condoms and so on. So it was really what I think of as a motivational approach. And so therefore, at the time when it came to disseminating, I think because of the nature of what was on the horizon at that time, it felt like it was harder for me to find a home of how would this get translated and how would it be disseminated if I didn't have some control over ability to answer questions from the users and do the trainings and all of those things. So I think part of my decision was this is something somewhat new, and I want to make sure that it's getting out, not filtered through users or others, trainers' mindsets of this being a particular kind of theory that's already out there or something. So I think that was a big part of it. And then I also think that I benefited greatly because I had, or I took the approach, but I also had the luck of being able to get grants just to package my intervention. So this was prior to the current PREIS approach, which I think is wonderful to be able to put that in your grant. But I was able to actually package the initial intervention through HIV funding. And then I did have something happen that's kind of like what Sharon's story was, in that I got it all packaged and ready to go and had master trainings and everything. And at that point, the CDC decided, these are little kids. We want to put our money towards, a higher risk population. So we're kind of going to shelve all this. And I would say within that same month of hearing that, which was kind of disappointing news, then I heard also from colleagues at CDC saying, congratulations, you're on the evidence-based list for pregnancy prevention. And then I had that wonderful opportunity of the initial generation, if you will, of what was then OAH, and how much they opened their arms to the developers and the disseminators alike, to including sending their project officers to our trainings, which was the first time something like that happened. So that was really a good experience of being let into that kind of concept that the project officer would know enough about your intervention so that when they get questions from their grantees, they could actually have a relationship with the AIM Service Center. And that's was a wonderful opportunity. Next slide. These are the 4 things that we'll address, but I wanted to just start off by telling you a little bit about that, that piece. Okay, this is just a kind of a layout of, it's not the only way to think about the kit, but it is the way that both AIM for Teen Moms, which was funded through PREIS, and the original Project AIM, this is the approach that we took. And I think I just wanted to make the comment here that it's really important to think of this sort of from, or at least for me, as like a human factors, right? So understanding a little bit of understanding a lot about your users and the context that they're in, and what is it that you can do to support them and support their feelings of efficacy and delivery, but also what can you build in to help make that fidelity more likely, right? So when you build your curriculum and your facilitator guide, can you use colors? Can you use graphics? Can you use icons that really will help them stick with how you would wish that they can deliver it in the settings that they're going to be in? So that's what I mean when I say fashion for fidelity. It's facilitator centered. So this may sound a little strange, but again, because my intervention was a bit different from some others, I took the approach in developing the training model and the training content from the perspective of a intervention itself. So in other words, my goal in a 3-day training was to have them be able to, in some cases, suspend their beliefs about what could be effective. Because my program, when you look on the surface of it, it looks like, how in the world is that going to change their behaviors? But that's because a lot of the program deals with things like emotional investment, ability to visualize your future in an image form. These things that to some people might sound a little touchy-feely, but they're actually very well grounded in the psychology background. And they're really grounded to be getting those young people invested. And in order to get the young people invested, I have to have the facilitators invested. So I think that's something to think about when you're developing trainings or working with those that are developing trainings. The workbook is a simple example of just like you can give them all the worksheets and then you're going to lose them, right? So if you compile a workbook, it makes it a lot easier for the facilitator to deliver. Thinking like that. Next slide. Okay, so some of our strategy considerations in the dissemination, I think I am somebody that probably could have another hour-and-a-half conversation with Karen about where am I on that list, but I noticed that there are elements that the AIM Service Center that was, again, I was in a position with an amazing set of team members and I was in a work situation where as soon as I made that decision, I'm not sure if I fully appreciated it, but maybe somewhat, that I knew that a quarter to a third of my job at times was going to just be this, right? Even though, so that meant that I had to have a job setting that supported me doing this, but I also had a model to be able to make the budget balance, right? So I had to do all of that pricing and all of that figuring out of what is the administrative cost. I definitely had to deal with the licensing. Part of our licensing is it is an attempt to control, but it's also an attempt for us to understand how is it out there, right? How is it being used out there? And if we do have a certification process associated with our training, and we also have used a train the trainer model. So this has been something, the AIM Service Center has been around for 12 to 14 years. And even at the administrative level, we originally started with everyone doing a separate contract with us. And I remember going to our fiscal person and saying, well, this can't work. And she's like, it's okay. Like if they want to make a change, we'll just amend the contract. And I'm like, that's okay. We have 7 users last year and 12, 14 this year. What happens when we get 60 users? There's not enough time in your job to deal with all the amendments to a contract year to year. It's not going to work. So we had to get a different fiscal standing and create a cost center. So those are things to think about as well. But the organizational settings and contexts here are really where it's being delivered. So I do think that we definitely focused on the scaling from the scaling outside of things, but we spend a lot of time in the deep part of the pools too. And I'm a big believer, because of my public health background, of thinking about the way, not only the way that your intervention is acceptable, but when we talk about fit, I think we're also talking about the fit with respect to sustainability. So what is the structural system? For AIM for Teen Moms, for example, by this time in the game, it wasn't a school-based program. It was definitely designed to fit within existing service structures. And that way, one of the things with my programs, and I think with most people's programs, is that the biggest cost is the personnel cost. And the personnel turnover is what challenges us, right? But if I know that there are these, almost every single state in our country have these programs for teen parents, they're usually predicated around a case management model or a nursing model or some combination. I want my program to be tied to a place that not only has the buy-in and the expertise of working with young teen mothers, But I also want them to be trained. I mean, it's ideal for me if the facilitator is already trained in all of those other services. So building the program for case managers and community health workers and potentially, nurses whose job it is to actually serve as a liaison between the young mother and all these other services, not only enhances the ability of my program to work, but it also enhances sustainability. It enhances institutional, it becoming more potentially part of the service itself, right? The overarching service setting. Intervention staffs, issues we had to deal with is sometimes when we have teachers as interventionists for Project AIM, we have to train them how to stop being teachers for a few days because we don't want the program taught. We want the program facilitated. So sometimes it's antagonistic directly with their way of that they've been trained as a teacher. And they need to understand that the activities, it doesn't matter if a kid is not with where everybody else is, because the activities are built in such a way to be redundant in terms of their core elements and so on. And it doesn't matter if kids miss, 25% of the sessions, they'll still be affected because of the way the program is created. So next slide. I'll just say a couple of things about adaptation. They're basically listed on this PowerPoint, so I don't need to go through all of them. Adaptation to me is a very broad world, right? So I'm like, what do you mean by adaptation? Sometimes in adaptation, they call us up and they're like, can we just do this? To me, that adaptation, they only need to do it one time. So they have to do something which I think of as a violation, which is change an order of the sessions to bring the guest speaker in. So to me, I have to talk to them through and say, this is a violation, but you have to do it because you can't get the speaker, whatever reason is happening. So I have to sometimes talk with the users and sometimes offer to talk with their project officer to explain to them why. But I don't personally believe or build programs that I expect to be 100% on fidelity, or I expect that the real world doesn't come in and intrude, right? This is interventions, and then the populations and neighborhoods and schools that we work in, their capacity has to be considered for what really are we talking about. We do have built-in parts of adaptation where they can change things because we want them to have ownership, right? So I think that we could do a whole 90 minutes on adaptation, but we do give a lot of guidance on that, and we do anticipate adaptation needs. We've spent the last 9 months doing virtual implementation adaptations for both AIM for Teen Moms and for AIM for Teen Moms and for Project AIM, and also virtual trainings. So we have trainer models, and we train directly. We've had for a long time a Spanish version of both of our programs, usually for, in the case of Project AIM, it's been used most extensively in Puerto Rico. So those are things that we have been able to do as part of the AIM Service Center. Next slide. All right, again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is, it may look a little bit silly, but I think the analogy works that, this is when people are looking at your program, it's almost like, a dating program or finding a marriage partner or whatever, that they have to fit in with the services. And sometimes if you build your package in a way to promote it, then what happens is that sometimes you give them a piece of your package of like, oh, you look like you're interested, go on this website, or we can send you this. And what you get is like either a response of like, this is what we already do, this is perfect, this is what we do, or this is what we wish we could do, this is what we've been wanting to do. So if you build your package to inspired that response, then the package is, I don't want to say it sells itself, but it's sort of, once you get it out there, people are really already invested in like, I picked that. Sometimes I ask people, why did you pick it? You didn't get a hold of us first. So just out of curiosity, they're like, oh, because, I found it on the government website and this is what was there. Showing off your strengths. And I don't know, I did put roundtables on here. I think roundtables is a great way to be able to sit down with somebody and talk to agencies about what their concerns are and what they're looking for. And finally, that kind of wedding is really what I mean about, can it really become in your setting something that's just happens, right? And in school settings, sometimes it's like the health education setting classes, they've been giving Project AIM for, you know, almost a decade, right? So that's just a normal part. And part of that, part of our way of helping them is to tell them the ways in which the state level educational requirements for their class are in part met by our program. So that's an example of building a tool that they can use to determine whether or not they can actually make it a part of their ongoing curriculum. I think that's it. Yeah, I'll stop there. I know I know we want to have a reflection. So, thank you guys.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Sharon. Such incredible information. And so in the interest of time, you can pass to the next slide, Cameron. We're going to leave this with you all to sort of take away and do some self-reflection. Encourage you to take some of this information back with your colleagues and just think about what are your next steps. And so do some self-reflection with that. And we also have a worksheet that will drop into the chat box on just a self-reflection activity to sort of guide you through thinking through some of those considerations. And we'll pick that up again on the upcoming cluster call that will follow up to this webinar in January. So let's go now to questions and answers with presenters. I know there was a few in the chat and we want to open it up for others to ask some questions. So we put a hold on one that Angelique had asked about.
Yeah, about the combo.
The combo. Yep.
Yeah, I think you could, Angelique, if you are in an organization that has branches and you want to spread your program to additional branches, but then you also feel like you're ready to offer and support other users, then I think you could consider a both combo, keeping in mind all the things Leslie and Sharon just talked about in terms of, and I think some of the 5 R's to really reflect, are you ready to support the users so it can be implemented well? And, you know, maybe that's just this doesn't all have to happen. Certainly there is no expectation that we're fully scaled by the end of PREIS, but we have this opportunity to think about it, reflect on it, and then create all the supporting materials. But I do think these aren't, and Leslie, your comment made me laugh. I think that continuum is like, it's clearly a way to think about different underlying constructs like control and what might work well for your program. And there's also variation within those, like even within the dissemination. Leslie, I know you talked about wanting to be able to answer users' questions. Well, that may be something that you could negotiate. We ask our developers how they want to be involved at ETR in terms of user questions. Some want us to funnel questions to them. Others say, nope, here's some, you know, framing key guidance, answer it this way. If you get a question you can't handle, reach out to me. So those are things you could negotiate if you partner with somebody like an HTN or a Sociometrics or a ETR for dissemination.
Great. There was another comment, and please feel free to chat, or I think they can go off of mute and ask their question. But there was a comment from Robin around the costs for an affiliation agreement in the development of a toolkit, and how much would something like that cost?
I don't have a direct answer for that, Robin. I mean, I think that would be something to explore with others who use that model. Leslie, I don't know if that's something that comes to mind for you immediately, but I would say I have to do exploration on that.
Yeah, I think we use a licensing approach, right? So it's not exactly the same thing as an affiliation, but I think where I do think that we work through affiliation is that sometimes capacity builders have a grant and they have the grant on, let's say, AIM for Teen Moms, but they're actually funding other service agencies to deliver the program. So to me, that's a little bit of an affiliation model where the oversight of what they're doing, the monitoring and the holder of the grant are at that, you know, what I would say higher level. And then they choose these to have, you know, anywhere from 3 to larger numbers, right? So that's an example to me of affiliation where the license holder is the person who's the capacity builders, or sometimes it's a health department, right? So we work like with Aim for Teen Moms, there's a number of agencies that are funded directly through the health department, and our relationship is with the health department. And so we will do the training, but we also have a relationship with that health department because they are the ones sometimes that get the information passed along to them and then ask us for things. So there's more than one level there. And sometimes like the state health department, the capacity builders for New York have been our trainers as well. So we've trained them to actually train the people within the state of New York, and we've worked with them on adaptations and so on. So I think those affiliations, there might be instances where we have memorandums of agreement or of understanding, but the licensing for us is really kind of where we hold the notion of kind of responsibility for that, for whoever's holding that license. I don't know if that answered your question exactly, but I think of that as the affiliation that we would have to use.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Cameron, I know we're out of time. If you could move forward, I just wanted to share a couple of resources. I know there was a question about if we'll be sharing the slides, and we will. We'd love to hear how you'll use this information to support your packaging and dissemination efforts. And as I mentioned, we'll be having a cluster call in early January, so we'll have an opportunity to dive into that a little bit more. You can go forward 2 more slides, Cameron. There's some great resources that we wanted to share from you, both from OPA, CDC, SAMHSA, and HRSA. All have like other tools and resources to think about that could maybe inform your packaging and dissemination efforts. And then if you go to the next slide, Cameron, there's some of the literature that we use to inform, I'm sorry, go back one. We do have some resources in the exchange. I think these were shared in the e-blast announcing this call, and we will share them in a follow-up thank you note as well, so you'll have them easy to access. And then if you go 2 more, there's some references, and then finally contact information, and then one more. We'll get to the survey. Oh, one more. We have a lot of finalizing slides there. Yeah, we'd love to hear your feedback on this. Chloe has also put it into the chat. There's also a tool that we developed that's in the chat. So if you have time, please take a moment, and we look forward to connecting with you all in the next few weeks to learn a little bit more about your plans and how we can support them, and what other TA you might need to get you to the to a good spot by the end of your PREIS grant. Awesome. I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and feel free to submit more questions to the APP at TTA inbox as well that you all have, and we can be sure to discuss them in the cluster call. And thank you to our wonderful panelists. This was really great to hear all about your expertise and experience with packaging and dissemination.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.